Good evening. My name is Mike Fields, and I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's moderator, James E. Wallace. However, before he comes out, I want to do a plug for the Grand Theater. I'm on the board here at the Grand Theater, and for a lot of you, this may be the first time you've been back to the Grand since it closed back in the 60s. If you haven't been to any of our shows, we're about halfway through the season, and it's been a good year, but we've got a fantastic second half. So there are tickets available for all the performances, and as you leave, pick up a brochure, and please come back and enjoy some of the entertainment that we provide. Secondly, we have this great opportunity if you'd like to volunteer to be a part of the Grand team and work at any of these events. I'm not sure if we have any volunteer forms out in the hallway, but all you need to do is contact the office and we'll be more than happy to sign you up. It's a lot of fun. So, tonight's moderator, as I said, is James E. Wallace, and I'll just refer to him as Jim Wallace because that's how I know him. Jim, in 1978, went to work for the Kentucky Historical Society and served as a staff member until 1990, at which time he was promoted to the assistant director and continued in that capacity until 2006 when he retired. I asked him if he took any time off from retirement. He said no, he just stayed at the same desk and continued to work for the society as its executive director of its fundraising arm. During his tenure there from 2006 to 2009, he helped raise over $8 million to support the programs and services that the Historical Society brings to us. So we're very thankful for all of his service and dedication. Jim has a BA degree from Morehead State University and an MA degree from the University of Kentucky. And he also has a certificate in fundraising. Jim and his identical twin brother Jerry were born in Cambridgeshire, England in 1957, but he was raised in Jefferson County, Kentucky, so he's really a Kentuckian by heart. I asked him if his parents were English, and he said no, his dad was in the military just doing a tour of service, so that's how he came about being born in England. We won't hold that against him either. Just had a mental blank. Jim and his wife Wanda and his daughter Katerina live in Bridgeport in a 175-year-old house. He has chickens, ducks, dogs, cats, and I'm sure a few other animals. But I think the biggest pleasure that Jim has is his two grandsons, Aiden and Christian. They're 4 and 5. And my daughter just had twins a year ago Tuesday, so I know the pleasure that those grandkids bring to you. Jim has served this country in the Army National Guard for the past 34 years in the 202nd Army Band. And he currently is a staff sergeant and plays the clarinet. So we've learned a lot about Jim tonight. And I'm trying to think if there was anything else that I need to tell you about him before he comes out. I think I hit all the highlights, but let me look. Nope, I think I covered them all. So, did a pretty good job. I don't know how Joanna Hay talked me into doing this. She called me yesterday and I was babysitting and I had one of the twins in my lap and I was feeding them and she said, well, will you introduce Jim Wallace? And I was happy with the baby, so I said, yeah. So she knows not to try that again. So I'm sure you don't want to hear any more from me. I'll say one more thing though. You're going to be entertained and enlightened tonight, and I used to work here at the Grand with my dad back in the 60s. After the shows, we would clean up. So as a board member, when we work after the shows, we have to clean up. So it's kind of like I've made full circle. But it's been enjoyable. And please, I'm so sincere about come back to the Grand and be a part of it. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Jim Wallace.
Well, good evening to everyone, and that was way too much Jim Wallace information. But anyway, the challenge tonight, the real challenge, is how to compress over 20 years of research and hard work on the part of all of these people here into the little time that we have. We're going to be looking at the relationships between the three projects that we'll be examining tonight, talk a little bit about their impact on Frankfort and our community. We'll look at how changing technology and information channels are changing the way that we preserve and share community stories, and there's a lot of good stories tonight, positive, uplifting stories that we'll be looking at. I'd say, and I think almost everybody here would agree, we are a blessed community. There exists a wealth of organizations right here in our town that are actively and aggressively working to preserve the story of our entire community. And consequently, the African American story here in Frankfort is much better preserved and documented than I think communities of similar size or even larger communities. But that is a blessing. There's a lot of people to thank, organizations, individuals, funders, specialists, who without their efforts, none of these three projects would have taken place. But rather than try to start singling out folks and organizations, I think I'll leave that up to each presenter to recognize those who have made these projects possible. There is one group of folks that we are going to recognize right now. Absolutely none of these efforts would have come to pass without the residents who took the time to share their life's experiences, to share their photos, their memories, and we owe them a tremendous debt of thanks, not only for sharing those things, but ultimately for the gift of their trust and their faith. So if you or any of your family members were interviewed or allowed access to photos, would you please stand right now so we can recognize you and thank you? Please stand on up. Anybody who's participated. Thank you so very much. Tonight was made possible by a group of organizations, and we will recognize these folks here. The Kentucky Humanities Council, the University Press of Kentucky, the Grand Theater, obviously, the Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky, and the Kentucky Historical Society. I think we have board members and staff members of all those organizations here tonight. I believe Kent Whitworth, who's the executive director of the Kentucky Historical Society, is in attendance. So if you're on any of those boards or you're an administrator of any of those agencies, please rise and allow us to thank you for making tonight possible. Thank you so very much. If you had friends and family members who wanted to be here tonight but could not be here, we're equally blessed to have Channel 10, Cable 10 recording, and so this will be on our local cable access here in the coming weeks. Well, let's get into the program. We'll look at first Community Memories, a glimpse of African American life in Frankfort, Kentucky. And that project is really an incredible model for how communities can become engaged. It was a model pioneered by Sheila Mason Burton, Dr. Winona Fletcher, and a team of very dedicated volunteers. So Sheila will present first. She'll be followed by Dr. Douglas Boyd, who will talk about his book, Crawfish Bottom, Recovering a Lost Kentucky Community. And Doug will be looking at the relationship between oral history and memory. And he'll be referencing some of the interviews that both he and I did that are part of that work. And our final presenter is Joanna Hay, who will talk about Stories from the Balcony and her use of oral history and documentary filmmaking as a medium for fostering dialogue and for preserving community history. We've got about 15 minutes for each presenter. And there'll be a session after the last presenter. If you have comments or observations, suggestions, questions, we'll have a little Q&A afterwards with all of our presenters. When that's concluded, if you liked what you heard and you wanted to get a copy of the Community Memories book or the Crawfish Bottom book, our authors will be out there in the lobby, I believe, signing books. You'll have to wait, I believe, till 2012 to get Joanna's book, but they are going to publish a Stories from the Balcony book as well. So let's just get going. I'm going to introduce our first presenter, Sheila Mason Burton. And I'll bet you everybody here knows Sheila. She is a Frankfort native and a mainstay of our community. She's a graduate of KSU. She retired in 2003 as the assistant director for the research coordination at the Legislative Research Commission. But she's back at work, still at LRC, as the compiler of the legislative record and the coordinator of their intern program. Sheila is a mainstay on many, many community nonprofit boards. She's a very giving person. If you'd find her as vice president of the Kentucky Historical Society, she's chair of the Plant Board and the King Center Board. She serves on the Green Hill Cemetery Board and the South Frankfort Community Center Board and the Grand Theater Fundraising Committee. And she is a charter member of the African American Genealogy Group of Kentucky. Let's welcome Sheila to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming out and participating in our dialogue this evening. As you can imagine, we could spend the entire session tonight on either one of these three projects. And so the most difficult task that I've had is trying to compress the Community Memories project into 10 or 15 minutes. But I've been asked to focus our attention on community engagement, engaging the community in these types of projects. And in fact, I think that the Frankfort Community Memories project is probably a prototype for community engagement. I think that the engagement of both the Black and white community in this project is far more extensive than folks might think. I have to start with John Gray and Historic Frankfort, Inc. John and Historic Frankfort, Inc. were a little disappointed with the representation of African American history in the bicentennial book that was published for Frankfort. So John's was the one who came up with the idea of doing a project called Community Memories. Had it not been for John and Historic Frankfort, Inc., we probably wouldn't even be standing here today. So I have to give John thanks for that. And then I moved to the Kentucky Historical Society. John approached the Kentucky Historical Society, and together they approached me, but the administrative and professional staff of the Kentucky Historical Society guided this project from the time we were conceptualizing it to the very end in the publishing of the book. Had it not been for the technical support supplied by, with regard to our oral history, Kim Lady Smith, and with our photography, Mary Winter, and the editorial genius of Melba Hay, along with all the other staff at the Historical Society, we would not have been able to have accomplished this project. And then we had a local dentist, Dr. Gene Birch, who agreed to spend his Saturdays photographing pictures that we asked folks to bring in. So folks would bring their pictures in, Gene would take a picture of it, give it back to him. We had about 4 sessions of those. And those turned out to be the basis for the database that we have established, Community Memories, at the Kentucky Historical Society. And as you know, projects like this can get quite expensive. And so John Gray solicited the support of the African American Heritage Commission for some funding, and also for city government, the Franklin County Bicentennial Commission, and the Kentucky Oral History Commission. All of them contributed to the initial phase of this project, which, as many of you remember, was not a book. It was a photo exhibit at the Old Capitol, here at the end of the mall. Now, after the initial phase of the project debuted, and it was so successful, and we had all of these photographs, and we had, oral histories, and it was just hard to walk away from that. And so, we convinced the Kentucky Historical Society to support us with the book. And obviously it seemed like a daunting task, that's something that probably wasn't going to happen because, that's an expensive proposition. But Farmers Bank and Capital Trust stepped up to the plate and they underwrote the book. And so with all of that in place, the most important people that participated in this project was a steering committee of some of my former playmates, some folks a little bit older than me, some of my parents, a steering committee of African Americans who agreed to, about 15, to advise us throughout this project. And then by the time we decided we could have a book, Dr. Winona Fletcher had returned from Indiana, was living back in Frankfort, just a perfect person to step in, and had it not been for the tireless work that she did in writing, researching, editing this book, we would not have a book today. So that's my list of thank yous. I hope I haven't left anyone out, but I want to talk a little bit about the book. Community Members is broken into 5 subject areas, and these subject areas stood out as themes as we were doing the oral histories on folks. The themes that from our research, from the 400 plus images that we had gathered, all of these seemed to tell a story. The first story it told was about community, and this picture here represents the community. It's taken in 1948, and according to the donor of this was taken on a Sunday morning after church in 1948. And some of these folks here we know, but it's a good representation of the community. Our community chapter is called Blessed Be the Ties That Bind, because certainly this community was bound and blessed by the ties that brought the unity to the community. But, the best description of community comes from those who live there. And so one day back in 1995, I visited Miss Mary Lucy McGee in her home on Langford Avenue and asked her about the community, and if you will listen to her response to my question. Is there anything you miss about those good old days? When you think about the black community now and the black community then?
The togetherness. Then everybody was door by door by door by door. Okay, when they started taking these houses, right today, I don't know where some of the people that live next door to me live now. And you don't have that togetherness because you're scattered. And people were there for you if you needed somebody. Now, I don't care who got sick. Everybody on Washington Street was at that house doing something. And then if they passed, they were there. Of course, at that time, they brought these bodies home. And they would stay in that house about 2 or 3 days. And every day, that house was full of people and food.
The second chapter of our book deals with family. He ain't heavy. We say that in the book, some of these families are so extensive that you have to be very careful when you're gossiping, because you might be talking to somebody's relative. You might talk, families within themselves might talk about each other, but no one outside the family had the privilege. This picture right here is a picture of Miss Maggie Shannon Carter and her 6 daughters. The last of these daughters just passed away this year. This picture strikes me because the caption under it said that 95% of the blacks living in Frankfort are related to one of these women. And I think that's very true. We then looked at employment. The employment chapter is, I don't feel no ways tired. These folks worked, and they worked hard, and they did good, honest work, and some of it was very laborious. Many of these folks worked for others, but some of them, we had several black entrepreneurs, and this is a picture of the Fred Allen barbershop taken back in the 1940s, maybe the early 50s. Our fourth chapter looked at religion, and the title of that chapter is Hallelujah Anyhow, because regardless of what the plight of these folks' lives were, they praised the Lord. I interviewed Reverend William Calhoun, who grew up in South Frankfort, is now a minister in Boston, and one of the quotes from him was, "We saw our future in church," and he's very true. One of the treasured buildings that was lost in urban renewal was the old Corinthian Baptist Church. And that's right here is a picture of the last service at the Corinthian Baptist Church. It was over on Miro Street. But if you look at the next picture, we see some of those same people, they're breaking ground for their new home over in South Frankfort. So though the building left, the tradition of that church lives on and is now over in South Frankfort. We're now looking at education. There were three revered institutions in the community. One was the Clinton Street School, and here's a picture of the 1909 class of the Clinton Street, graduating class of the Clinton Street High School. In the middle of that picture is Dr. William Mayo, who was the principal. And someone right now is restoring the Mayo House on Wilkinson Boulevard, I believe. But this is a picture of Clinton Street School. The next picture is a picture of a class in the 1950s of Rosenwald Elementary School, the school that was run by Kentucky State University. And then the last picture, I want to close with a picture of the Mayo Underwood teachers. Mayo Underwood, I think the last high school graduating class was in 1957. It closed its doors for good as an elementary school in 1964. Mayo Underwood was the heart of the black community, and it was the subject of a conversation I had with Wesley Joe Marshall. I want you to listen to a little clip of that. What was it you liked about them?
Well, they had a nice personality about them, and they were strict on you. They tried to make you learn. The learning was there, but you had to be the one to pick it up.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about Miss Holmes, because she played such a prominent role in most of our lives.
Yeah.
What do you remember about her?
Well, what I remember of Miss Holmes? Well, she took me on her wing, her and Miss Chase, and they gave me a little odd and end job, so I wouldn't be out here after the scuffle, to make ends meet and things. And bought my own clothes and stuff. Miss Holmes used to buy me clothes. Miss Chase used to buy me clothes. Then they used to take me and I worked for them around the house. Miss Mercy Holmes, she had a victory garden down here on the sandbar. And I used to take care of it. So we raised turnips down in there. And I took it. Was the overseer of her garden. So all the kids, when they get out of school, they would come down there to the sandbar and I'd take them down there and give them some turnips. So Miss Holmes come down, she said, "Lester," she said, "my turnips are missing." I said, "Well, I had some of the kids down there and I'd give them some turnips." So when I go back to school, she had me writing turnips, 500 pounds, on this poor man's paper. It's a great big old sheet of paper. And I was writing big, she said, "Well, you can all get another sheet," so I started writing small.
I want to end my presentation with this picture. And this picture speaks volumes to me. It really represents everything Community Memories represents. And this lady, this is Miss Catherine Demery. The only relationship I had with her was that she lived on my street. And she was this is her son, Johnny Demery. And Miss Catherine worked hard. I saw her going to work every day. I think she took in ironing, raising her family. trying to get them educated. One of her daughters now lives out, I think, in Oklahoma, is a doctor. But she really worked for her family. She represents family to me. She represents community. She represents the employment. And certainly standing here with Johnny, who went on to Moorhead, graduated from Moorhead, went to Washington, working in the medical field. She represents education, and she represents religion, because she was a faithful member of First Baptist Church. And we saw that religion carry her through some hard times, including losing her son Johnny, who was tragically killed in Washington. So when I see that picture, I just think of everything that that community gave me and spoke to me as far as values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. That was an incredible project. I was glad to be a part of it. Our second presenter tonight is Dr. Doug Boyd, who received his PhD in folklore from Indiana University. And he serves as the director of the Louis Nunn Center for Oral History at the University of Kentucky Libraries. Previously, he managed the digital program for the University of Alabama Libraries and served as director of the Kentucky Oral History Commission prior to that was the senior archivist for oral history and folklife collections at the Kentucky Historical Society. Doug serves as the co-general editor for the Kentucky Remembered series, which is a series of the University Press of Kentucky. He's the media review editor for the Oral History Review, and he serves on the Oral History Steering Committee for the Society of American Archivists. Doug received his undergraduate degree in history from Denison University in Granville, Ohio. Let's welcome Dr. Doug Boyd to the podium.
Thanks, Jim. The key is that I was at the Historical Society for like 8 years and started one of my first major projects dealing with oral history was working on the Community Memories Project and getting the opportunity to suddenly go through all of those interviews. In some ways, it was my job to go through and go through the oral history interviews themselves and grab these excerpts that were being placed throughout the chapters. And so I got to know these things really, really well. While I'm doing that, I'm also being a really good employee and doing everything that Jim Wallace asks me to do, because he was technically my boss at the time. And so Jim Wallace was giving a presentation at the Kentucky Historical Society, and I remember distinctly everybody who worked there present for the presentation, because we all worked for him. But if you've seen his presentation on Cable 10 about the neighborhood that is in my book, you know that in some ways he becomes sort of, well, he won't admit this, but I say it in my book, that he is a hero in the story. Because a lot of what this book is about how history is created. And so I want you to sort of spend some time thinking about how history is made, because there are some pivotal moments in the story of this neighborhood where history really changes course. And those are really important points to make, because I think stresses the importance of oral history, which we used in Community Memories, but also archives, which we were running a wonderful archival program at the Kentucky Historical Society documenting history. But Jim, as an employee of the Historical Society and also working on a degree, decided he was going to do a project for his master's, and that project entailed oral history of this neighborhood, and gave a presentation that just knocked my socks off. And I thought, wow, this is really an interesting story, and these interviews are in our collection. I'm going to check up on this. And what interested me most about it was the competing versions of history. You know, I grew up with a very traditional education in terms of history, and we were all sort of given a very sort of straightforward version of our country's history. And I thought about the neighborhood, and I thought, wow, you know, I'm hearing such different versions of this neighborhood. So that's what I'm going to talk about. How many people in here remember this neighborhood as Craw or the Craw? Okay, a good number. How many remember this neighborhood as the Bottom or just Bottoms? So about split, right? So I get a lot of questions about the title of the book. I called it Crawfish Bottom. And the reason was it seemed like the people who lived in the neighborhood referred to it as the Bottom or Bottoms, which was when Jim did the interviews. But it seemed that everybody who didn't live in the neighborhood referred to it as the Craw or Craw. So I really wanted to figure this out. When did the nicknames start to happen? And so I went through basically 50 years of microfilmed newspapers to try and ascertain this moment. And it was 1877 when the neighborhood, which was being referred to up until that point as the lower part of the city. You know, it's just sort of over there, the lower part of the city. 1877, a newspaper article in the Tri-Weekly Yeoman. I highly recommend reading it if you get the chance. Old newspapers are really fun to read. Suddenly came out and said, you know, that so-and-so from Crawfish Bottom. There are a lot of different theories, as you'll read in the oral histories or listen to in the oral histories, about how the neighborhood got its name. But Crawfish Bottom really was that sort of first nickname that came about. And interestingly enough, within 10 years, it had dropped the fish and bottom and really became referred to as Craw, the Craw. And typically it wasn't a pleasant nickname given to this neighborhood during that time period in the 1870s. I'm just going to I'm a big fan of Dr. Clark, Thomas D. Clark. When we think about how history is made by, in many ways, the people who actually write it down, right? If we don't actually leave record, we're left to the other people who are going to interpret it. And Dr. Clark had interviewed some folks from this neighborhood, and back in the early 1930s, for a book he published in 1941. And that's where you get the first on-the-record description of the neighborhood from a historical perspective. I'm going to read it. Just as there was the Barbary coast of San Francisco and the Rampart district in New Orleans, where the old-time flatboatmen cavorted, there was Craw in Frankfort. Down in Craw, joy was unrestrained. Playful logmen could go as far and long as they wished, so long as liquor and money lasted. Very dramatic portrayal of the neighborhood. It's not what I was hearing in Jim's interviews that were archived in the oral history collection. And that's kind of what drew me to look deeper into the neighborhood story. Then you get into this idea of oral history documenting stories that you know, you think about our stories that we keep in our head. If they're not written down, if they're not recorded in an oral history type of interview, they're gone when we're gone. And now children and generations might remember stories, but they pass it down. But memory of this neighborhood and the history of this neighborhood is being created, again, by the people who are going on the record. In 1965, when the neighborhood was actually being bulldozed, we had a gentleman who was a city official actually come out with the quote that says, to justify urban renewal, there are too many people thinking of the area today as the Craw. We have to overcome this stigma. When our kids grow up, they will never know the Bottoms were there. That's powerful stuff. People are actually trying to suppress that history. So the heroes of this story really become two people. Papa Jazzberry, James Papa Jazzberry. 1975 was one of the first people to actually come out and say, actually, this was a really close community. There was a newspaper article written in the State Journal that kind of picked up on this version of history that everybody was telling, the seedy underbelly. And he was the first one to come out and say, you know, that's actually not true. It wasn't just bad. It was a lot of real good. It was a really tight-knit community. And I know that was an article that heavily influenced Jim's research when Jim went out to do his interviews. And you'd actually bring the article to the interview, and say Papa Jazz was actually, saying it this way, and really framing his interviews in many ways in opposition to this version of history that was really going down in history. And so the heroics really are Papa Jazz Berry and Jim Wallace deciding, I'm going to interview these people and I'm going to tell a different version of this history. And so Reputation, which was really from the 1870s, between the 1870s and the early 1900s, the neighborhood did have a sort of wild reputation. But really, after the 19-teens, 1920s, this neighborhood was really a close-knit neighborhood. And that's a lot of what this book really focuses on, is trying to give folks a chance to articulate that. So here, let's hear some of the voices. Let's switch over to... So the... Let me get this set up here. Okay, so let's skip over to the next slide. Right, so neighborliness. We hear all about neighborliness, right, throughout, and we heard this with Sheila's interviews. So let's go ahead and listen to a clip about that.
There's so much that has not been written down that is only in the memories of people. Mm-hmm. Like I was telling you earlier, the few things that I've read about Bottom were mostly written by white people who did not live there, mm-hmm. who maybe heard some anecdotes or stories from friends, mm-hmm. and so they wrote about it as if the whole place was sort of a hedonistic kind of red light district.
No.
When you remember Bottom, what comes to mind?
Well, there's so many things. The first thing that comes to mind, neighborliness, closeness. We were black and white together. Next door to me was a white couple. If I had food and my next door neighbor didn't, I shared what I had because we were all poor together. There were some that had a little more than others, but as being black, most of us were poor.
So go ahead and skip to the next slide. The idea of reputation as history is something I work with a lot in this because we're trying to overcome... Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead and play it.
I tell you what irked us. It wasn't the people in that area that cut up. It was the people off East Main and South Frankfort that bring their dirt, and they be the ones that would do the cutting up.
And then they go home and you're all stuck with the reputation.
The reputation. And we had to let them know there was a lot of arguments about that. People over there were just decent people.
Yeah.
Everybody was just clean, fun-loving people.
What about Shine Boys? You remember Shine Boys?
Do I? Lord, he could cook. He was out the mountains, yes, he could cook. He had his business on Gas House Alley and Muro Street.
So I brought this text up because this is the text for the description of my book at next week or 2 weeks book fair. And I think it's really interesting because we're thinking about reputation as history, right? So it's hard to read, so I'm going to read it for you. That recovering Hawfish Bottom, recovering Kentucky, lost Kentucky community traces the evolution of the controversial Frankfort community with a, what's that say? Reputation for vice, violence, and it goes on and on and on. And then it sort of never makes the turn, and actually what it's doing is actually describing chapter 1, where I set up how it got this reputation. And then the subsequent chapters actually sort of go on. But I want to sort of talk about this idea of the entrenchment of reputation and how important that is. And then how important oral history is when it comes back in place. Because, we have a major oral history project. This thing has been running on Cable 10, Jim's presentations on Cable 10. The book comes out and whatnot. And still, there's this tendency sort of to nudge toward the stories about the sort of the vice and whatnot. Now, that's not to say there's not some good stories in here. There are, but really it is about how we create. So go ahead to the next slide, please. One of the neat things about it is that throughout, Jim and Sheila and Dr. Fletcher, who worked on community memories, were articulating community symbols. Because it's really kind of interesting because you're doing a history of a neighborhood in some ways that was no longer there. There's no visual cue for people to remember this. And so one of the things that Jim liked to do in his interviews was to toss out these sort of these community symbols and get people to talk about them. It was really remarkable to listen to stories about Corinthian Baptist and to hear about the stories about the American Legion building and to have this sort of building by building description of the important places to the community. And of course, Mayo Underwood was just revered by members of this community. And so let's hear a clip about Mayo Underwood.
Let me ask you about your school days. Where did you go, Mayo
I went
Underwood?
to Mayo Underwood. I started out in kindergarten, and because that was Mayo Underwood had been built. It opened up the year that I could go to kindergarten.
About 32, maybe.
Yeah, right. That's right. I was 6. Well, they let me go. Being my birthday was in June, and they let me start actually in the kindergarten. I think it was 5 years old, and I was in the first kindergarten class under Miss Johnson. I never will forget that. And then I stayed in school until I went into the war. I left in the 10th grade. I went to service, and then I came back in '46 and went back to finish high school.
In essence, oral history rescues the story of this community. If the Oral History Project hadn't come along and done this, the version of history that we would have would be what was written in the newspapers, would be what Dr. Clark had written. It was really interesting. Dr. Clark wrote that in 1941. I trace in here all the quotations of that Dr. Clark passage, and most of the prominent Kentucky historians that write anything about Frankfort quote that passage, and so that just got perpetuated over and over again. And now we have a different version, thanks to Papa Jazzberry, thanks to Sheila and the Community Memories Project, and thanks to Jim Wallace for this, and also thanks to the Kentucky Historical Society, because they're the archive that really has preserved these photographs and taken an activist approach to preserving the story of the neighborhood. So that's it for me.
Great. That was a great job, Doug. Excellent. Our final presenter is Joanna Hay, independent filmmaker whose work is informed by oral history as well. She's a graduate of Kentucky State University and has been a video producer since the early 1990s, trained as a community scholar by the Kentucky Folklife Program, and she was outreach director for the Kentucky Arts Council. She works with universities, nonprofits, historical societies, and individuals on a wide array of video projects. In 2006, she began to document the history of the Grand Theater in a project entitled Stories from the Balcony, which I think is slated for completion next year, right? 2012, and it'll be on KET, and as I mentioned earlier, there'll be a book. She also has an award-winning documentary that I suspect many of you have seen that's entitled Quest for the Perfect Bourbon, Voices of Buffalo Trace Distillery. And that is currently airing on KET. I believe it was a Nunn Center project. She's working on a cello oral history project for the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and also producing and directing a documentary on the history of the game of squash. She has an eclectic array of interests, doesn't she? She is the owner of Joanna Hay Productions, and by the way, she's an exceptional fiddle player as well. Let's bring Joanna Hay to the podium.
Thank you, Jim. Well, this is an exciting program. I'm just honored to be a part of all of this and just really thrilled that you have all come. I first became interested in the Grand Theater when there was talk of restoring this space and making it into a performing arts center, and I thought this would be really great for the community of Frankfort, and I think it has been great. I began to hear about the history of this theater. Growing up in Louisville in the 1970s and the 1980s, it was really hard for me to imagine what it must have been like in the days when African Americans had to sit in this balcony and white people sat separated downstairs. I began running into people who wanted to talk about those days, and this was the motivation for starting this oral history project about the theater. Two of my first interviews inside the theater, upstairs, before the renovation began, were actually Sheila Mason Burton and Mike Fields. And I was like, wow, listen to this world that I knew nothing about. Sheila and Mike both were, and I'm very appreciative to this day, they're willing to share their memories, their stories, and their insights. Sheila has become my mentor, really, in this project. And Mike, of course, you've heard him introduce the evening, and you'll also see him in the upcoming preview. And you'll see Sheila and others as well. Many others have generously shared their recollections. Whether white or black, there is a common experience of coming to this theater, even if the races were separated. And I think many of us actually came of age going to movie theaters all across America. It's a common experience. Stories from the Balcony has had support from the Kentucky Oral History Commission at the Kentucky Historical Society and also the Kentucky Foundation for Women. And as you'll see, this is actually still a work in progress. So we're looking at projects that are each in a different stage of their development. I'm planning to complete the documentary and the book next year, but we are still conducting interviews as the story continues to develop. So I'd like to show you next a 9-minute preview of what Stories from the Balcony might look like when it's completed. It's about 9 minutes.
Those theaters were packed all the time.
Oh, every Saturday, and downtown was mobbed.
Everybody, if there was anybody and a nobody or whatever, they came to the Grand.
Highlights of my life when I got to go to the Grand Theater. I thought that was something real big.
Admission to the theater, Grand or Capitol, was $0.25. Popcorn was $0.05, a drink was $0.05. So if you had $1, you could live pretty high for a day downtown.
On Wednesdays, they would have a free show for children.
Some popcorn or some candy or something, you know, and sometimes I would have some ice cream with me. And I enjoyed the, most of the time when I would come, it would be on the movie, on set, Western movie, I love Westerns.
A cowboy came to town, he was Lash LaRue, and he and his horse were out in front. And it was a black horse, and he was all in black, and instead of a gun, he had a whip, so he was Lash LaRue.
The cowboys were sort of like the astronauts of the day, they were really the heroes.
I was always crazy about Shirley Temple and her curls. That's why I love curls right today on account of Shirley Temple.
But I can remember that particularly the bun candies, the round bun candy had chocolate candy with some nuts in it.
And sometimes at midnight they'd have a scary movie. But I imagine I went with my sister, Dorothy, because we went everywhere together.
The Grand Theater was really a big part of our growing up.
I guess as an African American, this was the only place that we could, go to the movie theater. Couldn't go anyplace else in Franklin County, so this was it.
If you were looking at facing the theater, the left side was for the whites, and the right side was the African Americans, and they went up the steps.
This side is where the blacks purchased their tickets, and on this side, which led right into the main area, of course, we went up some stairs.
Balcony, that's where we sat. I had to remember that.
The kids from down behind the old Capitol there in what was known as the Crawfish Bottom, Crawl or Bottom, whatever. We all played together, and there were white kids and black kids and poor kids and not so poor kids. And so a lot of times we'd walk up here together. We'd get in one line, they'd get in another, and they would go to the balcony, of course. We would go to the main level, and we always wanted to go to the balcony, and they always wanted to go to the main level, so it was kind of a bit of a conflict, but of course when we get out, we'd regroup, go back to the old Capitol Yard, and that's kind of the way things were.
Segregation, I never understood that to begin with, but since I was born, it was always the fact there, you were not allowed to go in downstairs to sit down. You just couldn't go. So when we came to the movies, you got your ticket, you knew where you were supposed to go, and you just did it. It wasn't an afterthought. You just did it automatically because that's the way things had always been.
One of the sweetest ladies ever, her name was Sadie Garrett. She was good enough to sort of help raise us. And so periodically, I guess when she had to have a break and have some calm, she would bring us to town to the theater. And of course, Sadie was African American and could only go upstairs. So we would, as everyone else did, we bought our tickets outside, but then we climbed the steps to the second floor and gave them our ticket up there and bought our popcorn at the upstairs popcorn machine and our drink at the upstairs drink machine, and would go in and kick back and watch the Saturday afternoon matinees. It was just, you never thought, I didn't, it never occurred to me, black or white. It was just sort of a fun afternoon.
I think that's one reason why we threw the popcorn over and the boxes and stuff, we thought, well, if we can't sit where we want to sit, so when it was time for us to leave, we just threw the popcorn, boxed it all.
All of my memories about the Grand are very positive. Yes, I remember that I couldn't go downstairs. And I remember, that sometimes as we kind of passed on the sidewalks, that there were words exchanged that weren't very nice. I didn't get bent out of shape about that. I didn't like it, but it didn't diminish at all the fun that I had, in this building.
Yeah. I walk right up and down the street out here. What is that, St. Clair? Mm-hmm. With our little Freedom March.
I had heard from my grandmother and everybody that Martin Luther King was coming to town and having a march on Frankfort.
It was an event that I don't think anybody in Frankfort will forget.
I remember, I guess, when Martin Luther King came to Frankfort to march.
My children and I marched up Capitol Avenue, and I was holding Dr. King's hand. I made sure I got to hold it.
was a small, landing here. The confession was right along in this area right here. It was glass front.
Every now and then put something up over the screen. The picture come out. Look at this little window here. So if you put something up over it, the screen would go black.
I think the Grand Theater was a very, very important part of growing up in, because it was a place I could go, my friends could go, my parents could go, and see a good movie and have a good time.
This was a place to come, and when the lights went out, you were just in another world. and when you emerged into the real world, it still was a good world.
So that's a little taste. You can see lots of people talked and told their stories, and it was really wonderful. Tomorrow I'm gonna actually put a clip, I'm gonna put that on the website, which is storiesfromthebalcony.com. So www.storiesfromthebalcony.com. It's not there yet, but I am gonna put that preview online so you can watch it, show your friends. Also online, I have a little place where you can send me comments or tell me some stories. So check out storiesfromthebalcony.com. I want to add, there are two Frankfort women mentioned in many of the interviews about this theater and about Frankfort. Miss Roberta Wilson, she was the African-American ticket taker who apparently ruled the balcony with an iron hand. And Miss Helen Holmes, president of the NAACP. One or both of them will be an important part of the final documentary, and I plan to continue to research their lives. Last month, this is a total coincidence, in Denver, Colorado, at the National Oral History Association conference, I happened to be seated next to civil rights leader Vincent Harding, who wrote several speeches for Dr. Martin Luther King. Mr. Harding asked me about my work, and upon hearing about Stories from the Balcony, he said, "The story of civil rights is not being taught in schools. This should go into the schools." I agreed. Okay. He handed me his card and encouraged me to continue these endeavors. For my generation and younger generations, not everyone knows the deeply nuanced and complex story of segregation. Many, even here in Frankfort, are unaware that Martin Luther King Jr. came to march on Frankfort in 1964. Organizations like the Kentucky Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities have helped support this project to date, and we continue to seek grants to fund this next phase. Once the documentary is completed, KUT has expressed interest, as Jim mentioned, to airing the program. You can follow progress on the project at www.storiesfromthebalcony.com. To summarize, I think everyone's stories are valuable. It is with the stories of the past that we can understand the present and inspire the future. So, thanks to all of you for coming out this evening and participating in this discussion.
What an inspiring clip there. I can't wait to see the completed product. We have gaining access to all this content that you're hearing about. There's a special resource under development, and I'd like to ask Sarah Milliken, who is the administrator at the Kentucky Oral History Commission, which is an agency administered by the Kentucky Historical Society. She's got a little update on how we can access some of this content that we're seeing.
I'm just going to stay down here. I just wanted to make sure that everybody knew that you can access all of the original footage, the interviews, the images that you've seen, plus what you haven't seen, at the Historical Society just down the corner. We are so proud to have been able to support the documentation efforts as well as the projects that you've been hearing about tonight and the continued dialogue about this topic. We think history changes all the time. The more you learn about it, the more we gain a different perspective of historical events and how they shape today's events. So if you're interested in listening to an interview with a particular individual or just seeing what interviews are there for oral history collections or looking through the images, you can go for the Crawfish Bottom, the project in the collection is actually called Frankfort Craw. But you can also search for the bottom at kyhistory.com. It's on our digital collection, so the interviews are up online, the images, as well as the Community Memories Project. The Stories from the Balcony Project, we are going to be putting those up online starting in January. We developed a website with Joanna to make sure that those are presented to you in a way that makes sense and it's easy to access. And we will have the full video interviews up on that digital collections at kyhistory.com. So please, please, please go and check them out. Listen to the entire news, read the transcript, see the pictures. Don't just let it in here tonight. Go out and see what the whole thing is. And if you don't want to go online, you can of course come down to the Historical Society in person Wednesday through Saturday. Our doors are open. Come on up to the library. We will pull the stuff out for you. We are so excited to see this being used and to have it reintroduced to you all.
Thanks so much, sir. The next, there are two final little phases here. There's a question and answer opportunity and a chance to share your observations. I think they're going to come out here a little closer to center stage, and let's let them get set up. After that, we'll have a book signing outside for anybody who would like to purchase a book. Sheila and Doug will be available here to sign copies of the books. I will do my level best from here to identify anybody who has an observation or a comment or a question that they would like to ask, but it's a little dark toward the back, and if I don't see you, just stand up and state your question. I'm going to exercise one privilege as moderator. I'm going to ask the first question. We talked about these three separate projects, but I don't think that does justice. I don't see these things as three separate, distinct things, and I'd like our panelists to say, what are the connections between all of this? What are the relationships? Did one effort inform the other? How did they make them possible? So to put you guys on the spot, what's the synergy?
I guess I'll start. I think we have a symbiotic relationship between all three. Obviously, Jim, you started this with your interviews, which were the basis for the community memory interviews. Now, when we did community memories, we added to the interviews that you had already started. And of course, I think we certainly added to the photographic database of the Historical Society. I think Doug probably also used your images, your oral histories, our oral histories and our images in his project. And as Joanna and I have worked on Stories for the Balcony, I sent her back to those collections so that she can get a connection with people who were part of the history of this. So, I think that the symbiotic part comes, actually, this book, Community Memories, is several years old. I think we published it in 2003. And because of these two projects, all of a sudden it has new life. So.
Other observations, Doug?
I was just gonna add, in some ways, like Sheila said, it started off as not a book in mind. It was an oral history project and a photo documentation effort and an exhibit, and it just sort of grew. And it's fun to sort of see the different media that is representing this body of work now, because as Sarah Milligan just said, you know, it was an exhibit, it was book, you know, it's documentary, but these archival resources now you can access online, you know, in your pajamas, in your kitchen. You can, you know, every single home or building in the craw or the bottom were rescued by Jim and some other folks, and as the appraisal photographs, they're all there. And so not only can you listen to people tell the stories, but you can look at some of these photographs. And I think the sort of weaving in of different ways of presenting this history in really exciting ways is a common thread, because we're sort of growing, and the story is being told in all kinds of from all kinds of different perspectives, but also in different formats, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah, that's what I was going to comment on, is the changing formats and the technology. Did you start your interviews on cassette tape? Were they cassette tape? Yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
So we've moved from cassette tape through now digital audio recorders and now digital HD video, and then being able to deliver that through digital technologies out on the internet.
Well, I'll give you one other point, and then we'll start getting to questions. The thing that every one of you have done, and it's an important thing, you treated the people that you dealt with and the content that you unearthed with respect, and that generated trust. And without trust, none of this would have been possible. And I think you're all to be commended for the way that you've handled your relationships here in the community, because that has really opened doors that might not have otherwise been open. Does people, questions, observations? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. If the people who live in the bottom refer to it as the bottom, then why does the Kentucky Historical Society refer to it as Frankfort?
Well, can I jump in on this? Okay. I got a perspective on this, and it's totally Jim Wallace, which 99% of the time is totally wrong, but here is my perspective. To say craw and to say bottom is not to say the same thing. Craw is a subset of bottom. Craw is a very small slice of real estate, mostly at the corner of Washington and Clinton Street. It is a vice district that is mainly a destination for outsiders. Bottom is a neighborhood. It is integrated. It has every social institution, churches, schools. It has a middle class. It's not the same thing, okay? And so I've always thought bottom was much higher ground than craw. That's the way I look at it, okay? And I don't think the Kentucky Historical Society has any official position on what the term. I just don't think you can use them interchangeably. And let me ask our panelists their opinion.
I think that I would like to see, go back to the 1870s when it really was referred to as Crawfish Bottom, because the whole area you're right, there was a distinction between the two, and especially from the perspective of the people who live there. But I think from the naming convention, I can't speak to that, but traditionally, it was, because it was before my time at the Historical Society, but traditionally I think we got the photo collection from a neighborhood entity, right? And so during that time of urban renewal, after urban renewal, a lot of people from the outside were referring to that neighborhood as the Craw and Craw. And so when that photo collection came, I think that was sort of a natural impulse by the archivists to call it the Craw collection. So, but I'd like to lobby for a name change myself. I think that would be really cool. We can go on record here and say, sorry.
Does that address the question down here, sir?
Well, the name Crawfish Bottom, it wasn't necessarily a derogatory term, was it? I mean, it was a descriptive term because of all the flooding.
The recurring flooding.
Bring crawfish up into this essentially a floodplain. And so it was a descriptive term historically. It may have degenerated into a problem. To me, it was kind of a derogatory term. But I don't know But I mean, I think Crawfish Bottom is a descriptive of the marsh, the floodplain.
Right.
Sort of a neutral label.
And there are neighborhoods around the country that were referred to as something bottoms. You know, the bottoms was really often close to, you know, the low-lying areas next to the rivers that were often flooding. And so, no, that's exactly right. It wasn't derogatory. It wasn't until they started to drop the bottom and the fish to make it just crawl that it became sort of a derogatory term. And then, you know, a lot of the interviews talk about, you know, taking that derogatory term that next step and actually referring to people, the outsiders, referring to people who lived in the neighborhood as crawbats. You know, that was a common phrase that a lot of people talked about. And so
as a derogatory term.
As a derogatory term.
Yes, please just rise, and I can't see back there.
It's Dr. Fletcher, isn't it? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, and really, you know, that does get to that question that I tried to raise when I brought up that description on there, is the idea of oh my gosh, yeah, is this idea of marketing, you know, books and whatnot, and that's at that point becomes very much out of my control. In fact, a lot gets out of my control at some point in this process when a book is created. And so, you know, reading that description, it was like they're describing the first chapter. You know, they're not describing chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that is unfortunate. So. Yes. That's right. No, the newspaper, yeah, that's right. And they really got into and interviewed people who were from the community, and that was nice. Mm-hmm.
I think I saw a hand over here toward the center. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm not strictly speaking a historian. I'm an art historian, and I know all the problems with written histories in terms of issues of accuracy. How can you assess the accuracy of oral accounts? I just know that oral accounts that occur in my family are of all kinds. I wouldn't necessarily call it. I mean, how do you decide what is historical?
Well, you know, I think that oral histories are not for researchers, are not the preferred source of data, but I think they're gaining more respect. Mm-hmm. Sometimes oral histories are, you know, not definitive, but they certainly lead you to look for definitive sources. I'm sorry.
You know, Dr. Clark's quotation that I read about the neighborhood, you know, Dr. Clark is revered as a Kentucky historian. And every historian, Jim Clotter, Bill Ellis, all these people who wrote about, you know, followed that quotation. And so with oral history, you know, I think there is the same sort of, there are holes that can be poked in oral history. In fact, I bet, you know, a few of us in here have embellished on occasion on our own life stories sometimes, depending on the circumstance. And so the question, though, really cuts to my favorite answer to that question, which I get a lot with regard to oral history, is the idea of the power of the archive. Because one story is just that. It's one story. It's an important story. And it's important that that story is part of the historical record, but it is just one part of the historical record. In many ways, the most important thing about oral history isn't necessarily this sort of ultimate truth, you know, which version is the right version, because nobody can determine that. It's not possible. But what you get with oral history is a significant amount of meaning and connection of an individual to a story, an individual to an event, or an individual to a time or a place. And I think that's very important to remember. You know, there are stories in Jim's interviews and Dr. Fletcher's interviews and Sheila's interviews that are sometimes over the top and potentially questionable in terms of that. But in some ways, individually, it's really that individual meaning. But when you put all those things together in a repository like at the Kentucky Historical Society, and you have, you know, what they have now is like 8,000 interviews, not all in Frankfort, but total, what is it, 10,000, 9,000, I need glasses, 9,000 interviews in that collection. That's when those stories all come together to build something. And when you look at Community Memories, you know, it's a collection of interviews and photographs and all of these things that come together. And you look at Joanna's, you know, work on the Grand, which is taking a very specific look at community history, and you look at the sort of body that's created, that's when you really start to see the patterns, and you start to see the truths, and you start to see those kind of things emerge.
Jim, can I just, I think Doug said in his presentation that had it not been for the oral histories, the reputation of the bottom would have been its defining mark. And when the lights came up, I saw the mother of all these projects. Now, I know I'm going to get in trouble. I know she's going to, but I see Miss Henrietta Gill, who really started the entire effort. Miss Gill's sitting right there.
I don't wish to embarrass Miss Gill, but almost all the interviews that I did back in 1991 would not have occurred without Henrietta Gill going and opening doors for me, because I didn't know any of these people. I think she would call ahead and say, "He's okay." He won't steal anything. Be honest with him, and you'll enjoy it. So thank you. I'm so glad you're here tonight. You are a keystone in all of this. Other questions, observations? Yes, ma'am.
Did urban renewal kill the neighborhood, or where the people were displaced and moved farther? Had they rebuilt it, kind of then the feelings of the neighborhood?
The question is, did urban renewal actually kill the neighborhood, the community spirit of the neighborhood when all these folks were displaced, or have those connections somehow been maintained? Is that community spirit still in existence? I think that's what you're getting at.
Well, you know, there may be someone in the audience that might want to respond to that, because we certainly have folks in the audience that were displaced. I mean, you know, obviously we saw one institution, Corinthian Baptist Church, that was torn down but relocated, and it's still a very viable, thriving church. Mayor Wonderwood was lost, but you know, there's a reunion every 3 or 4 years, 2 or 3 years, where folks still keep that memory alive. But you know, I think you heard Miss Mary Lucy McGee, Ms. Gill, in their oral histories talk about what they thought was lost, and what was lost was not the tangible things; it was the intangible things. But again, someone out there might want to speak to that. Mike.
I guess when the Douglas Public Housing Unit was built, it was built specifically for relocation purposes of people coming out of the urban renewal project downtown. So very many of those individuals moved to Douglas Avenue.
I believe Riverview Terrace also was one of the units that went up.
It was later.
Okay. Douglas was first.
But you know, Jim and I did a project last year for the Fair Housing Authority of Kentucky, where we did a bus tour of folks from across Kentucky. They came here, and we took them to North Frankfort, and we contrasted the urban renewal and the displacement of people in North Frankfort with what happened much later with the displacement of a black community in South Frankfort. Mm-hmm. And there are vast differences in how those folks were treated. Part of that is because the people 20 years later saw what happened before then, so they were wise, and they didn't let what happened to the people in North Frankfort happen to them. And part of it was because folks at that point felt a little stronger in saying no. So if you look at those two models, though, if you look at what happened when urban renewal happened in North Frankfort back in the 50s and 60s, I guess, in the 60s, and you look at what happened with South Frankfort when the flood wall displaced those black neighborhoods, you're going to see two vastly different ways in which those folks were treated.
And there was a lot of anger at the time when Jim was doing the interviews, and a lot of frustration about the urban renewal process. I think it's fair to say that I think the city fell somewhat short in terms of its promise of providing alternative housing, and so a lot of people were displaced, and a lot of people really at the end of the interviews, a lot of times you would go into this sort of talking about their feelings about the displacement. And, it was really interesting. Some people were, at one point likened to the state office tower to sort of a tombstone. Somebody said that, we always kind of secretly wish that it would kind of just sort of,
sink into the ground.
Sink into the ground. But almost inevitably, if they were displaced, they would talk about saying, I'm out here in this neighborhood, I'm all by myself, and I don't know any of my neighbors. I think that community did change, in some ways, and transform in many ways, like with reunions and whatnot. But I think physically there was a lot of isolation that occurred. And, again, urban renewal, as a policy, failed nationally. We weren't the only ones to sort of say, oh, we're going to kick everybody out of downtown. We're going to put all kinds of stores down there and wonder why people aren't shopping downtown because we kicked everybody out of downtown. And so there's been a lot of sort of recovery around the country from urban renewal policies.
Or May Chaney is still alive, May Chaney's brother.
No kidding.
Cincinnati.
Which theater did she go to?
Thank you.
Which theater would you go to?
We're going to wrap this up. Other observations? Yes, sir.
Let's talk about movies for a while. Sheila, is John Sykes here?
There he is.
We worked together 30 years.
Hi, Johnny.
My question is to Mike and Johnny and Sheila. There used to be a theater across the street called Frankfort, and the capital of the street. Franklin died before the Grand and the Capitol Center. Could you have gone as Afro-Americans to either the Capitol or Franklin when they were open? If you had something great on it.
I'm going to let Johnny answer that because he's older than I, and I don't know about the Franklin.
cleaned it up to put the blacks out, and we left it till that theater.
Let me ask you, Joanna, when did your Grand close?
In the late 60s, I think it was 66, 67. What Johnny Sykes mentioned about the blacks used to go to the Capitol Theater at one stage, and I think it was in the 40s, pre-war or during the war. And Vincent Parsons, I did interview him. His father was the manager of both the Grand and the Capitol, and he talked about that, Johnny, and he talked about how after the war, the blacks were relegated to just the Grand Theater's balcony.
But then if you come back after the Grand closed, pretty sure for whatever the Capitol stayed open.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Well, and there was a time when the Grand was also, where it was no longer, you had to sit in the balcony, it changed, but at the same time, the theater was in decline.
My mother just turned 98, the 12th of this month. Carlos Fallas was her brother-in-law. You asked me, Dr. Boyd, about speaking to her. She can't hear the thing, she won't do it. When she was 16 years old when John got killed, you asked me what happened to Carlos and his Fallas. When the early review moved them, John Fallas, by the way, was a friend of black and white, poor or rich. I remember Mr. Robb that had done beautiful, nice nursing, funeral home. Those type of people we lost, Frankfort. Yeah. We really did. But my mother questioned you a couple of times when she said that Carlos wasn't there watching the girly show at the carnival. He was there with three guys that they had been boxing with Cecil Powell teaching how to be cold and glove boxer. They were there to box a guy from the carnival.
Well, I stand corrected. I appreciate you.
She was there with him when that happened. And her older sister, Carlos, was married to Edith, which was happened to be. Carlos lived longer than his mother. When the urban review took her, they moved to Home Street. She died about 1964. He died about 3 years earlier.
Miss Ellis, is that you sitting there? Marie's first job was selling tickets at the Grand Theater. In what year? 1953.
Wow.
Do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
Anybody? One last question? Here's the question.
We heard on the boat tour yesterday, the nice boat tour that the Frankfort Parks does, that they had found a cemetery underneath the transportation building. Where do those remains go?
The question is, if you remember when the DOT, Department of Transportation, put up the new office building during the Patton administration, they unearthed a cemetery there. And where were those remains taken? You know, I hate to admit this, I'm not that sure. We have a gentleman back here. Up to... Okay. Reinterred up at Fort Hill. Okay. All right. I just want to say one last thing, and then we're going to have the book signing out there. We owe these people a great debt of thanks. They have done, this content is enduring, and what they have done has just been beautiful. It's good for our spirits, it's good for our community history. Thank you so very much.
Dr. Fletcher, will you stand up? Dr. Fletcher.
Dr. Fletcher, can you stand up?
This is Dr. Winona Fletcher, and I hope if you buy any Community Memories books that you'll get her autograph.
Thank you all so very much for coming out tonight. It's been a fun evening.